Hello, everyone. I'm Terry Schwartzbeck, Director of Communications at Research America. Welcome to today's webinar on key insights into Americans' view on science. A special thank you to our Alliance members who are joining us today. As you probably all know the drill by now, we are in webinar mode and all audience members are on mute. However, we are looking forward to a very interactive discussion, so please type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and my colleague Sarah Chang will answer them or ask them during the Q&A time. You can also use the raise hand function and we can unmute you. Today's discussion is a very important topic about Americans' views on science and trust. I'd like to welcome, first of all, Research America President and CEO Mary Woolley. We're also joined by Cary Funk, Director of Science and Society Research at the Pew Research Center, where she leads the center's efforts to understand the implications of science for society, and Chris Volpe, the Executive Director and founding board member of ScienceCounts. Cary, I'll turn it over to you to start.
All right, fantastic. Hello, everyone. So happy to be here and to be part of this session. Just going to give you kind of a high-level overview of what we're seeing across Pew Research Center surveys and hopefully kind of point to what I think they mean. And I'm going to go ahead and advance the next slide. I'm going to just walk you through this is our kind of freshest data from January, but really the moment we're facing here is a very different science policy landscape. But all the divisions that shaped that hard-fought election campaign are still very much evident in public opinion. So that's going to be part of the story here. So as of January, what you're looking at is the little dots represent a different an opinion about how important this issue should be for President Biden and the new Congress. And we're just kind of skimming over the big picture here to show you that among Americans overall, that's the top row, 80% say strengthening the economy should be the top priority. And just below that, almost the same, 78% say dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. But the two rows below that are showing you the divisions by political party. So among the GOP, you're seeing the top issue there is strengthening the economy. 85% of Republicans and independents who lean to the Republican Party say that. Other issues fall a little farther down. And the coronavirus is important to a majority of Republicans, but it is around 6 in 10 who call it a top priority. On the bluish dots line down below there are Democrats, and what you're seeing there is 93% of Democrats saying that handling the coronavirus should be the top priority. That is, kind of as close to consensus as we typically see in public opinion polls. And there are a number of other issues that are important to Democrats, but they're all just a little bit below this idea of handling the coronavirus outbreak. So you see 75% is the kind of the second most common response, and 75% saying that strengthening the economy should be a top priority. So that's kind of the landscape that I think policymakers will be facing, and also important to remember that there tend to be differences, particularly among Republicans. So we see on the Republican side, moderate or liberal Republicans tend to be more showing more priority around handling the coronavirus outbreak than conservative Republicans. I think the figures are roughly 72% of moderate liberal Republicans call that a top priority, and around 52% of conservative Republicans say that. So let's go ahead and go forward. In a way, the political divisions you're seeing are policy priorities. Of course, these have been a key part of public opinion during this era of a coronavirus outbreak and global pandemic. And what you're seeing here is a series of surveys that ask people to rate the degree to which the coronavirus outbreak has been a major threat to public health on kind of the left-hand panel, and to the economy on the right-hand panel. And what has been striking for so long is that back in March, there was some degree of kind of consensus between Republicans and Democrats, but then as early as late April, basically 6 weeks later, we started to see this division, bipartisan grouping, and what you see now are really pretty wide divisions between Democrats and Republicans on the degree to which the coronavirus outbreak is a threat to public health. There's a lot of agreement that it's a threat to the economy, but I think what's striking about this is that we're used to seeing political divisions over policy approaches, but here you're seeing really a fundamental difference over kind of the scope and nature of the problems that we're facing as a society. And those divisions really have played out. They're symbolic of the kinds of divides we've seen play out throughout this whole period, around issues like the need for restrictions, around issues like wearing masks, and even around the sense of urgency around getting the coronavirus vaccine. So that's the landscape we're sitting in, and go ahead and move forward. And of course, one of the main questions for the science community has been, how does this influence public trust in scientists? So here you're seeing a rating of public trust in medical scientists, and we have the same story for scientists as well, but and I'll walk you through it. So the green bars are showing you just kind of before, after. We're just focusing in on these more recent data points around public confidence or trust in medical scientists. And really comparatively, we're focused on the darker green bars down at the bottom, which is showing you the kind of strongest level or highest level of trust in medical scientists. So before the pandemic, I think in December, 35% of Americans had a great deal of trust in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public. After the outbreak started, we saw that go up to 43%, and then the 40% is roughly similar in a more recent survey of November. The red and blue columns are showing you that there's something going on under the hood, in that the uptick in public confidence in medical scientists has not been uniform across Americans. And what you're seeing there is that among Republicans, it's actually been stable. If anything, went down just a little bit in November of 2020. And on the blue bars, what you're seeing is that most of that uptick then was among Democrats. So as a result, you're seeing now a political division over how much confidence people hold in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public. A couple of things important about that. Number one is that it's new. We've done lots of different judgments around people's views of medical scientists, including this exact question. We haven't seen these kinds of wide political divisions before. And we've done lots of other kinds of questions around medical doctors or medical research scientists and so on. And we typically don't see political divisions up to this point in how people saw the medical community. So that means that what I think we're facing is a kind of a new landscape, at least for the time being. I would say it may change how you want to think about building bridges, building common ground in this space as it's become more politicized. A couple of other things about this. Number one is that when we think about trust, really trust is multidimensional. This is just kind of the measure that we use as kind of a single way to look at a broad view of how much trust people have in scientists and their work. The questions we ask typically do have some piece of it that says trust to do what. So here you're saying trust to act in the best interest of the public. And that is in keeping with how many people think about trust, that trust is a kind of expectation. And it's like a trust being like a relationship between two people, here between two groups, the public of Americans and the group of medical scientists, two very broad groups. The other part of that is that you're seeing that I focused on the kind of strongest level of trust. You see on this slide, there's another group that has what I call a kind of soft level of positive orientation towards medical scientists. And then there's a smaller group that has a more negative view, saying they have not to or no confidence in medical scientists. And we can move forward. I won't dwell on this slide, but this is really showing you the same pattern. If you were asking what turns out to be a separate group, because we divided people, they rated one group or the other. And you see the exact same pattern of a growing political division over trust in scientists generally. And trust is and we're just going to sit on this for half a second. Trust is really, no, it's okay. It doesn't matter which slide we look at, really. Just want to point out that, we spend a lot of time talking about trust, and the question is it's how we look at it. How should we be looking at it? And I would argue that we should be thinking about it as a general metric, a general kind of indicator about public reception or reception to scientists and their work. But sometimes your real interest has to do with something more specific. So we're going to talk about the coronavirus vaccine as an example where trust comes into play. And then we can go ahead and go forward here. This data is as of November. If you've been following along with this story, you know that one of the key markers of public opinion, first of all, is that it's been fluid over time. It's been particularly fluid in terms of people's intention to get a coronavirus vaccine. And so this, as of November, was really just on the cusp of when we were first about to get access to emergency use of coronavirus vaccines. So, and if you've been following other public polls, you'll know that I think in general, public polls have been showing a little uptick even from here. But what I want to focus on here is not so much the number. I want to look at the factors that are influencing people's level of intention to be vaccinated. And that's the next slide. There are lots of differences among people. If you want to look across demographic groups, I'm not going to talk about that just yet. I want to look here in the middle, and what you're seeing here is the relationship between people's trust or confidence in the vaccine research and development process and their intention to be vaccinated. So people who have a great deal of trust in that vaccine R&D process, 88% of that group says that they would definitely or probably get the coronavirus vaccine if it were available. There's a much smaller group that has a kind of negative view of the vaccine R&D process, but you can see here that they are largely intending not to get vaccinated. 8 and 10 say that they would not get or probably would not get vaccinated for the coronavirus. So to me, this is a great example of why we talk so much about trust in the scientific community, is that we're looking for things like this as trust as an indicator or marker of how it can connect with specific issues that we're facing as a society. There are certainly other factors involved in people's views about their interest in being vaccinated, and I'll just touch on the one on top, which really, in my mind, it has to do with how much people say they are personally concerned about getting a serious case of the coronavirus. People who are more personally concerned, more likely to say that they'll be vaccinated. Those who aren't particularly concerned, thinking that they're not too or not at all concerned about this, less likely to do so, or in this case, more divided. And I see this as aligned with a sense of personal need to get vaccinated. We also see this in terms of older adults more likely to say they'll be vaccinated compared with younger ones. That also kind of ties to this sense of need, with the idea that older Americans are more at risk of getting a serious case of the disease. Now, let's go ahead and move forward. I just wanted to then take us back to a kind of broader point, because we are sitting here on top of a kind of new landscape for the science policy community. But I think, if anything, the pandemic has really underscored the degree to which the world of science, technology, and innovation is really being played out on a global landscape. So I thought we could just step back with this data that shows us a lens on how Americans fit compared with others in this kind of global context. So this was from an international survey we completed just before the pandemic fully took hold. And it's among 20 publics, primarily in Europe and Asia, just a few other places. Each row is a separate question. I want to call your attention to the 2 rows in the middle first. And what you're seeing here is that Americans tend to stand out both in terms of their sense of importance, that the country be a world leader in scientific achievement. 69% of Americans said that. And that's higher than many other places we surveyed. And then just below that, you see Americans also tend to stand out in the esteem that they hold for our scientific achievements. 6 in 10 Americans saying that the US is the best in the world or above average compared with other nations when it comes to scientific achievements. But I suppose, we never really show you data that's all either good news or bad news. So the slight counterpoint to that is on the top row, where you see that even though 82% of Americans are saying government investments in scientific research are usually worthwhile, that's really right in the middle of the pack compared with these other publics who are also typically a little more places that are investing heavily in research and development. So that just gives us a little bit more of a lens of where we fit. And I think overall, generally you're seeing a lot of positive value for and esteem for science in the US. So with that, let me turn it over to our other panelists, and I hope we'll have a great discussion about this.
Great. Thank you so much, Cary. And we already have some questions coming in, but we'll get to those, I think, after our panelists have all spoken. So I'll turn it over now to Chris.
Thank you, Terry. Let me screen share here. Okay. Well, good day, everyone. Thank you. And I'm Chris Volpe, ScienceCounts. I'm going to build off a little bit of the great warm-up that Cary has done, talking about public attitudes about science. I want to provide a brief overview of some recent shifts we've seen in Americans' attitudes towards science. I'm going to move pretty briskly. So we're going to put a link to these slides in the chat now. So please feel free to download these slides and take a look at them, at your leisure. Also, next week, ScienceCounts is going to release a series of reports about this data, but in much, much greater detail. So you'll really, for the data hawks, can really kind of churn through that. And I believe we'll push links to those reports out, via an email early next week. Okay. I just want to provide some context about ScienceCounts and why we're doing this. For the last 5 years, with the help of our partners and supporters, ScienceCounts has been laying the building blocks for a novel public engagement initiative called Raising Voices for Science. And we're excited that this initiative is going to launch this year in 2021, but that's a story for another day. What I want to do is share some of what we think are interesting insights from 3 of the foundational research benchmarks that we've conducted in 2015, 2019, and then most recently 2 months ago in late 2020. Couple thoughts about the methodology. These surveys were conducted with our research specialists at Edge Research. They were conducted via online panel surveys. Sample size was over 1,500, which puts you at about a plus or minus 2.5% at the 95% confidence interval for whole samples. But I'm going to spend a little time breaking Americans down into subgroups. And so when you look at segmentation, a kind of a good rule of thumb is that the confidence interval is about plus or minus 5%. We've enjoyed the support and partnership of about 30 organizations, philanthropies, professional science societies, industry. But I want to especially call out the 6 organizations that helped fund this latest 2020 research survey. So we track a battery of questions around various fundamental issues with regards to public attitudes about science. One is priorities. And so in 2015 and 2019, we asked Americans, which issues urgently need the attention of scientific research. You see curing diseases at the top, and we give some examples just to warm up that question: cancer, Alzheimer's, et cetera. And then you see space exploration down there. And for the space enthusiasts, don't panic. I really want to focus on the word urgently here. This is not a soft like or dislike. This is about high priorities. One of the notes was there was very little change, very little shift between 2015 and 2019. Looking at 2020 now that we are in the COVID, as some people call it, there's dramatic changes. And as Cary said, the top three things that Americans care about are COVID, and the economy. And what you see is that at work here. Pretty much everything that doesn't directly, connect to those three things, really two things, is taking a back seat, probably for the moment, but we'll have to see. But here you can see, the role of scientific research with regards to jobs and economic growth has skyrocketed up 25%. It's always important to look and see, whenever you have a shift, who's responsible for that shift, if it's a broad population shift or if there's just one or two groups that are driving it. And so I just want to look at the segmentation. What we typically do is break Americans out based on political ideology and education level. And the reason we focus on those two demographic characteristics is because those tend to be the ones that matter the most. And so what you're looking at here is the Americans broken out into 9 groups: liberals, moderates, conservatives, and we've simply vertically separated them so it's easier to read. And then for each, we've broken them down into 3 tiers in terms of education. Instead of having to look at the key back and forth, let me just give you a safety tip. The more sides a polygon has, the more education that group has. So squares have 4 sides, triangles have 3 sides, and as my kids say, circles have 2 sides, an inside and an outside. So there you go. And so you could see in this case in 2015, there's generally, broad, similar support among these 9 groups. 2019, virtually the same. Again, if one of these polygons doesn't move by about 10%, don't read too much into it. But now we look in 2020 and we can see that generally there's a broad shift upwards, led by conservatives and moderates. But there's a shift among liberals as well, with one exception, and that is high school educated or less liberals. They seem to pretty much be where they were in the past. All right. Another battery of questions revolves around trust. And as Cary said perfectly, in my humble opinion, these measures of trust are sort of a good general barometer for a sense of goodwill or lack of goodwill that Americans have towards science and scientists. Absent of a specific context, you can't read too much into these numbers. But in 2015 and 2019, we asked 3 questions about them. And again, there wasn't much change in those 4 years. We added 4 new questions in 2019 and then tracked them as of 2 months ago. And here again, we see a shift. And generally, it's a double-digit shift, about 10% upwards, which is a pretty big jump. Again, though, it's very, very important to look at the segmentation and see who's responsible. Is this a case where you just have one political ideology driving the show? Or in some cases, do you have polarization, which is being masked by the mean? So looking at this, the one question with regards to reporting that go against the sponsor, 2015 and 2019, there was a slight erosion in trust, and that was largely due to conservatives. But here in 2020, we have everybody moving upwards, although not to the same degree. Liberals are moving up they've jumped more than conservatives. The third battery has to do with public opinion about the role of scientists outside of the lab. And I'm speaking figuratively when I say lab. To what degree the public sees it a high priority for scientists to engage in various other aspects of society, in particular policy. And so we didn't ask these questions in 2015. We weren't clever enough, but it became important that these were really important things to track. And so we added them in 2019. Again, they're relatively low, but I want to emphasize that the question asked about high priority. And looking at 2020, there was a net movement up, again, of about 10, 11% for these four measures. And again, it's important to understand which groups are responsible for the shift. And so focusing in on interacting with government officials, looking at the segmentation, we see here compared to 2019, and again, I don't think that this will be a terrible surprise to many people. In 2019, you do see a pretty sharp partisan divide by a factor of 2 between liberals and conservatives. In 2020, though, generally, the public has broadly moved up and has a more favorable view of scientists interacting with policymakers, and in particular for conservatives, that's led by highly educated or the most educated conservatives. So for those of us who are, care about audience research and science communication and engagement and crafting specific messages, to provoke dialogues with particular audiences, this is the kind of information that hopefully is very useful. And then the last battery I want to share is another barometric reading, which is sector favorability. And so this is the percentage of respondents with a favorable impression of various sectors. And in 2019, you had, the most favorable were nonprofits and the US military. Least favorable were pharmaceutical companies. 2020, the radical shift. Obviously, the value proposition of pharmaceutical companies has changed with the advent of COVID. And so there's a dramatic jump. But more broadly, we see, again, this general warming or favorability towards all things that are science, where you look at federal government science agencies and the scientific community, which is up 6%. And for my last slide, I just wanted to look at that third one, scientific community, and really break that one down based on population subgroups and see what's going on there. And so here you see on the left, that's the overall mean shift of 6% upwards. And then looking at the individual segments, and again, if it doesn't move by about 10%, don't put too much stock in it. But as far as political ideology, this is being driven largely by liberals. In terms of education, looking at that measure alone, it's being driven largely by those with high school education or some college or trade school. In terms of age, it looks like it's being driven a little bit more by the older age group, 55 and above. In terms of race, ethnicity, there's I think a noteworthy jump among the Black community. And this is an important one, given what we're dealing right now, as Cary said, with vaccines. It's well known that the Black community has, certain apprehensions, and justifiably so, with regards to the medical community and vaccines and stuff. I don't want to say that this is an opportunity to relabel someone from medical to just science, but it might be, and there's some other indicators in our survey that scientists, for example, Dr. Fauci is looked at more as a scientist than as a physician per se. Those might open up some doors in terms of communication and reaching underserved communities. And then finally, in terms of gender, the jump is largely due to women. So I just wanted to thank you for that opportunity and remind everyone, please feel free to, at your own leisure, go through those slides, and every line item we have broken out that you saw there in those tables by segmentation in these forthcoming detailed reports. So I hope you find that useful. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Chris. That was great. I can't wait to dig into these a little bit with some of the great questions we're getting in. But first, I'm going to turn it over to Mary Woolley. She will be presenting some of Research America's absolutely hot off the presses data. So, Mary?
Thanks so much, Terry. And thank you to my friends, Cary and Chris, for just superb glimpses at our very robust data sets that stand behind what you showed us. So I'm going to show you a few just selected findings from a very new public opinion survey. You can see that it was just in the field at the very end of January. And we will, as others have said, we will be sending out a lot more information on this full survey over the next several weeks. So let's move through it. Again, like Chris, I'm going to move quickly here. Survey methodology is as for others. So here you see a reflection of the same sort of thing that Cary told us about, of top priorities with COVID, number one, and assuring economic stability and growth and growing jobs, which are clearly related, coming up as close seconds, if you will. Let's move on. Now, thinking about other than COVID, what about other health issues? And you saw in Chris's data that the apparent urgency of putting science to work for non-COVID health-related issues has declined. We haven't seen that per se, but you can see a dramatic difference here in what comes second. For years, we have seen the cost of healthcare come up as number one or number two, pre-pandemic now, not at 8%, but at much higher percentages. But if you, other than the COVID piece here, the differences between other rankings are not high, with a couple of exceptions. Let's keep going here to the next slide. You can see that once we get into what's the second most important health issue, you can see that mental health has moved up. And I think that's very much reflecting the attention that we've all seen to mental health challenges during the pandemic, broad range of those challenges. Meanwhile, apparently, concern about obesity has declined. Let's go to the next slide. So a little different than Chris's data, but certainly on trend with this question over time for us. We can see that very high percentages of, and this is across the population, but it is also true across party identification. We can see very high percentages saying that investing in research is important to achieving key priorities. And right up there at the top, we see, again, economic recovery and job creation, economic growth. They kind of all go together, but followed right away, immediately, when you add very important and somewhat important, the importance of attacking other priorities by putting research to work. Disease, preventing and treating diseases of all kinds, clean water. Let's prevent the next pandemic. You can read the rest. Next slide. Now, this is a measure of trust. It's that confidence word. Cary and Chris both have touched on this, but you can see here over two time periods, so they're both within the pandemic window, August last year, and now January, we've seen an uptick for everybody, all these different sectors as represented by individuals. So we're not really talking about the sector, but the individuals now. Increases in confidence level, including for elected officials, which might surprise you. And maybe this is a little bounce from the inauguration, maybe not, but just general optimism. We don't know is the short answer to that, but it is interesting that there is an overall uptick. Next slide. Now, as Cary and Chris have been working with this question, which I think of as having been pioneered by the Wellcome Trust, about the benefit. Does the work of scientists benefit you? Does it benefit society? We ask a whole battery around this. This particular question is about benefiting you, the individual. And you can see it on the left column, all American adults, and then broken across some subsectors. You can see the differences there. Personally, I think a goal for the science, the research and innovation community is to get to the day where everyone in our society feels that the work that scientists do benefits me. That's where we're headed. That's where we ought to be headed, serving the public's interest, and that means everybody. So if that is our goal, we're not there yet. This is an interesting metric to see how we're doing and where we've got the toughest problem. And that includes when you look at the partisan landscape, the Republican and Independent group. It includes African Americans. Chris addressed that. And really, it's everybody, because we haven't got to where we need to be in the science benefits me, and that means everybody. Let's go to the next one. Now, this is a question that we designed specifically for this survey. We don't, of course, have any trend data on it, but I thought it was relevant. The question is just states that there's been a great deal more attention to science during the pandemic. Some people say that science in general is now more trusted. Others disagree. What applies to you? So you can see this broken down by political identification, and is self-identification, by the way, of course. And you can see that there are differences, although overall, only 1 in 5 say trust has declined during the pandemic. I think that's very positive indicator, and should give us, I think, confidence as communicators and advocates that the pandemic is working in favor of science in terms of, and you've seen it in the other data sets shown here, favorability of the scientific community has risen, and we've seen that kind of increase as well. The question is, can we maintain it? Can we touch everyone across different segments? And can we grow it? So next slide. These are 2 different questions, but displayed together so you can see how remarkably similar they are, which we wouldn't necessarily have anticipated. So we're asking here about both, in one question about whether it was essential that publicly funded research was part of the drive to develop the vaccines, and then private sector funded research and development. And you can see that there is remarkably similar agreement among the broad public about the need for both. And I think that is especially reassuring to those of us who talk about the importance of the full ecosystem. So we're happy to see this. We're going to take a little deeper dive into it in coming days and weeks to see if segmentation can help us be even better at articulating what might be more problematic responses and those of concern. So next slide. Kind of in the spirit of the public funded portion of that last slide, we've been, as some of you know, who've been following our work over the years, for many years, almost 30 now, asking this question verbatim, which was originally put in the field by the National Science Board 40 years ago, verbatim. So we've been watching it over a very long time between their work and ours, and we have seen an uptick now in 2020, and that would have been August 2020. Oh no, actually that was January 2020. And just very recently, a few days ago, There had been a dip back in 2017. We don't particularly understand why, but it is now back up. So next slide. Dr. Fauci was mentioned. But here, this is a slide, this is a question we've asked for a very long time, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. We see that most Americans still cannot name a living scientist. So the question is, can you give me the name of a living scientist? And then for those who say yes, we record who they named. And of course, they still are naming Stephen Hawking, not realizing that he has now been dead for several years. But that said, big uptick, not surprising for Dr. Fauci, Anthony Fauci. But interestingly enough, not enough to drive that 1/4 who say yes up to half or more. Chris mentioned that maybe thinking of Dr. Fauci as a scientist rather than as a medical person might change perceptions. Interesting thought. I will say that Dr. Fauci has been mentioned in this question for years and years and years, far before the pandemic, but he's now clearly top of the charts. Next slide. It is astonishing to reflect on the fact that more than half of the American public cannot name any medical or health research institution. Zip, zero, nada. More than half. You know, that's another problem that we need to solve before we can make science feel like it's real and close to me, down the street, in my state, in my town. You also see in this data, though, that there's big uptick for Pfizer in particular. Moderna is on the list for the first time ever, which is not surprising, it didn't exist previously. But CDC up as well. And the Mayo Clinic down. Well, that may not be even statistically significant, but it's worth noting. No knock on the Mayo Clinic at all, but the increase for Pfizer and the CDC is quite strong. Next slide. Now, this also fits with previous data that you've just seen from Chris about the importance of scientists informing elected officials about their research, which we at Research America have been promoting for a very long time, along with many of our partners. The American public wants this, expects it, and it's time to deliver. Next slide. And people also say that scientists should inform the public and its impact on society. And with that, I believe I'm finished. Is that the last slide? Yes, thank you. Look forward to our conversation, and all these slides will be available immediately. Okay,
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Mary. Wow, we have a ton of questions and I want to get to as many as I can. I'm going to start with one from Mary. From a Mary and for everyone. We've noticed, we see an increasing move regarding vaccination for coronavirus towards trusting local representatives, such as family doctors, rather than trusting media or representatives of the medical community. Do you notice this trend, and do we need to rethink our science communication outreach?
Well, I'll jump in and say, yes, we saw it. We actually have a question that directly asks that. Maybe we can put that up if it's handy, Cary. You know, the trust in your doctor, your source of medical care has gone up during this pandemic time. And of course, that's important to work through a local source. It's also totally supported by research around other vaccine efforts and treatment. Get to a local trusted purveyor of information if you want to make change happen.
And that's consistent with trust in a broader sense beyond COVID. I mean, it generally, kind of the rubber meets the road when it has to do with, does this individual or entity have my best interest at heart? And so ultimately, that's the question someone is generally asking when we use the word trust. And you're dealing with folks, familiar folks who are local, who are in your community, who share a larger part of your micro ecosystem. Generally, that's why there's a stronger trust, comfort level, confidence that those individuals are working with my interests at heart.
Great. Sarah, do we have other audience questions that you want to jump in with?
Thanks, Terry. We do. We have so many questions, but the next one I'm going to say, this can go to any of you, but for Cary in particular, it's worrying to see the fall off in trust amongst Republicans in scientists. Does this track with low trust that those respondents had in other institutions, or were scientists a special case for them?
Thank you for this question. So yeah, we tried to use some data reduction here, so you didn't see everything we've ever collected. We do also look a lot at people's trust levels in other groups and institutions. We draw a lot of help there, I think, in terms of understanding what we're seeing. And that's what was particularly concerning, is that we're seeing, first of all, the uptick overall in confidence in scientists stands out compared with other groups and institutions and society in our data. But this increased political polarization, if you will, is unique to scientists. So, each group is a little different in terms of the kind of the underpinnings of public opinion around that group. But I would say it's a special case for scientists that's coming through during this period of a more coinciding with a more politicized conversation around the outbreak.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Amanda, and sorry, I just lost it. Let me find that again. Actually, we'll go with this one next. Given the disconnect between polls and the result in the past two presidential elections, is there a concern that the types of polls being presented today are falling into a similar trap of maybe not representing or accounting for the views of individuals throughout the country?
I'll start in on that. I mean, we spend a lot of energy evaluating the quality of our samples and really working to make sure that we have samples that are as representative as we can. And we're doing more. We don't get into this kind of predictive polling of who's going to win the election. We don't do that directly, but we certainly look at the results and we say, are polls overall biased in some way, perhaps because of, some people being less willing to participate in a survey. And so I'd say we're doing even more as we move forward. But I'd say the data is as sound as we think it can be. And we're always looking for ways to make it better. One of the things that gives us more confidence is when we see these patterns over time. That helps us understand better that it doesn't seem to be just today's data. That tends to give us more confidence in the findings.
I will underline everything that Cary said. She said it wonderfully. And I would just add, I think the challenge that political polling faces is a bit of a unique phenomenon. I think it's there's a sense, particularly among Republicans and conservatives, that political polls over the last few years have been used as push polls to push agendas. And so they are more actively sabotaging. I don't know if that's the right word. Maybe that's the first time that word's ever been used with a poll, but that's where you see that. And so I know Cary and Mary Research America, and we are very careful in the way we phrase questions, not to appear that we're pushing an agenda or brush up against, particularly controversial issues to trip that off. We try to stay very clear of that. And as Cary said, when you have multiple measurements over a period of time, that gives you a certain grounding, you feel pretty good that you've hit bedrock in terms of measuring real things.
All
Great.
right.
Another question. I just want to jump in. There's a really good that question from Amanda that you were going to ask Sarah. As we look to increase trust in science and scientists, to what extent is this a problem of communication and engagement versus a need for scientists and science to be more worthy of trust?
Okay, this is a hard question. So yes, good. These are good points, and of course they're not mutually exclusive. So so there's certainly lessons to be taken here for science communication, and what can we do better to help encourage kind of a positive relationship with scientists and their work. But there, I guess this comes up a lot in terms of how can you make trust even stronger. And one of the things I'd come back to is that think of trust as a relationship, and like a relationship, it takes care and nurturing, and it takes that nurturing over time. If you have had a breach of trust, right, it takes extra care and nurturing because you need to repair that relationship before you could ever boost it further. So I think both of these points are really important.
That's really well said, Cary, and we don't need to belabor the point, but it's a good question.
I'm going to jump in with one more before I turn it back to Sarah. I feel like there's some good news in this data, and there may be also some maybe less positive news or some worrisome things. Do all three of you have sort of a takeaway of like, what's the good news? What's the bad news here for science?
I'll give you one piece of bad news, not only from what we just saw today, but some polls we had in the field last summer for the Science and Technology Action Plan group that's available. We can maybe even put a link into the plan here in the chat. But we saw there that young people in general, 18 to 28, year olds, were generally less enthusiastic about science and about institutions. And there's some speculation about why that is, that kind of fits with disengagement from the political environment and from a lot of actually downright disastrous things that have happened to people in that age group over their lifetimes, certainly as young adults, including the pandemic, but before that as well, and living through a tense period of global warming and other threats, economic downturn previous to the pandemic. So, but those are speculations. We don't really know. We don't really understand that, but I think it is disturbing and worthy of a lot more attention.
Thanks. How about you, Chris?
So I shared what I think was good news in that there seems to be a warming with regards to trust and comfort with scientists, getting out and engaging policymakers and the public, and these seem to be great opportunities for those of us, in science communication, advocacy, engagement, and policy. Sort of the dark lining around the silver cloud is that there seems, at least we see, and because we're really, really looking for it, there's growing evidence that there's a bit of an identity crisis building when it comes to American branded science. Americans think science is a great thing, generally speaking. They look at it very much in terms of payoffs, hope for specific outcomes, cure this, solve this. But what's breaking down is a sense of any difference between American science and, say, Chinese science or European science. And again, this may not sound like a bad thing, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but at the same time, a leading argument for investing domestically in science is to remain competitive nationally. So rectifying a sense that more and more of the public, doesn't seem to, just like their TV, which wasn't made in the US of A, doesn't mean that their science needs to be made in the USA. How do you rectify that with spending lots of taxpayer money on domestic science? And then the other side of it is, and we polled this, we've been polling it for 3 years, the majority of Americans believe that if the US lost its leading role in STEM research, it would have no negative impact on their lives. Kind of have to digest that for a second. So again, and Mary showed a lot of this, the sense of a lot of positive energy around science, and science is a good thing. But you know what? If push comes to shove, maybe it's not the end of the world, and it doesn't necessarily affect me in my local world if the United States is no longer a major contributor to scientific research. And I think that's kind of a looming problem. It's going to only grow. And I don't know the answer to solve it.
Yeah, I'll just add one more thought on this. I mean, one thing I like to keep in mind, first of all, is that I think it has been a time where we have seen pretty rapid shifts in public opinion. And in that regard, we're still kind of early in this process. So there is still a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen as we move forward. And some of the uncertainty is about how much will the coronavirus outbreak and all of its associated kind of elements start to dominate how we think about science generally. And I think we don't know how much that will last over time and how much it will kind of color how people think about science in the long run. And so what I'm looking at down the road are some of the things we've been hearing today is how much people are seeing the relevance of science for their lives. What does that mean for how they engage with science? Which groups of people are not particularly engaged with science? And, is there something that we could be doing to try to help bridge that? And I think that's kind of where I have my eye down the road.
Great. Sarah, I think we have time for maybe one last question.
We do. Cary, I think that this kind of goes with what you were just saying. Many of our participants in today's call are advocates and to make medical and health research a higher priority. How can they use this data? After today's call, do each of you have a call to action after this?
Yes, hopefully everyone will get a quick word in. I mean, we do think that our data kind of, if you want to make a difference, one thing you need to do is find common ground. So you need to know where the divides are among the public. So that's part of what we're doing, is showing you where the fault lines are so that you can then find ways to bridge those fault lines if that's your area of health policy research or whatnot. So certainly the concern here is the extent that we're now seeing a more politicized conversation around science, or at least around the coronavirus related research, that makes it more difficult to find that common ground. And so that's something you need to think about as you're trying to build consensus.
I could jump in on that point. The call to action I'd suggest is to get involved, not take what you've seen here as interesting, but not about me, and rather make it, what can I do to make a difference? And absolutely do not write off people who don't share your own ideology, whether that's expressed in terms of partisanship or otherwise. And if you can, find ways, and people can help you. Research America can, so can your professional science societies, AAAS, and many others. Find ways to talk about what you do as a scientist or as a supporter of science to serve the public's interest, everybody's interest, not just your own, and not just for a small group of like-minded people.
Yeah.
Chris?
Science, we all know on this call that science is incredibly beneficial to society and to us as individuals. It is clear that for many Americans, that connection doesn't exist. And so they look at science as a tool. And, they are asking the question, why does this matter to me and how does this benefit me? And so much of the research that we shared here today is audience research. It's to inform us, as Mary and Cary has said, this is about relationship building, understanding what people care about and, the things that they have to deal with. And then our job is to figure out how to show them, how science, benefits. It's not about science mattering more than the things people care about, but it's about science. How does science benefit and elevate the values and beliefs that people already have? That's it. And so this is audience research that helps us understand, how others are seeing the world. Some who think a little more like we do, and others who are very much in a different reality and dealing with different sets of problems. And that's our challenge. And we have to work hard to build those bridges.
All right. Well, Terry, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Yes, I wish we could go for another hour and answer all these questions and dig deep, but we are out of time. So thank you so much to Mary, to Cary, and to Chris for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you to all of you who watched. We have noted all your questions. We'll see if we can address them in future materials. And you will be able to find a recording of today's presentation and additional materials on our website soon. The link is in the chat. For our Alliance members, join us next week for a Research America Alliance member meeting with John Burklow, Associate Director for Communications and Public Liaison at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, NIH. John will join us on Tuesday, February 9, to discuss NIH's priorities for 2021 as the agency continues its effort to assure that science wins out over this and future pandemics, advances research aimed at other deadly and debilitating health threats, and contends with emerging issues such as cybersecurity breaches. So thank you again. Stay safe and stay connected. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.